Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Breakers. My name is Taylor, and I'll be your host today. And as always, Tanner will be joining me here in just a few seconds. But first, we just wanted to take a minute and, kind of acknowledge that it's been a weird week. No doubt by now, if you've wanted to, you've seen the video of Tyree Nichols in Memphis. It's horrific. It's awful. And, I think it's important that we acknowledge that and use that as an opportunity to kind of look inwards, do a little reflecting, and kind of just think about some of the systemic problems that we face. Obviously, this isn't the platform for it or the forum for it. We're here to talk about shipwrecks, but I do think it's important that we always stand up for what we believe in and that we at least acknowledge those things going on.
I think it's also worth mentioning that, as these things get discussed, we seemingly have a new incident like this to discuss every week. Not that long ago, there was Keenan Anderson in LA who was killed by the police. And there's dozens, hundreds of other examples of these things happening. And I think for people who have seen the video, one of the, I guess, jarring things about it is that it isn't out of the ordinary for what we've seen. There's nothing in the video that stands out as something we've never seen the police do to someone before, and specifically to African-American men. Obviously, it's being discussed a lot, and I think it definitely is necessary to listen to the people who are coming at it from a place of experience, and people who kind of have the qualifications to talk about it, because I don't feel that we necessarily do, and it helps to listen to those voices. We're two suburban white guys who the police have historically not been a problem for us, not someone that we've ever had to feel threatened by. But that is a matter of fact for a significant portion of the population, and to see it happen so consistently, and it's baffling to think that there's people that don't see it as a systemic problem. So yeah, it really does take an assessment of what is happening. What do we allow to happen in our country?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like you said, I don't know. I don't have a solution to it. Whatever the solution is, it involves a radical restructuring of what we consider to be policing in the country.
Yep, I think that's it. And like you said, I don't have the answers, and there's a lot, anyone that says they do have all the answers isn't telling you the truth, is the way I look at it. But yeah, I don't know. I think we both kind of agreed, I didn't really want to do a regular intro today, and just to kind of discuss that briefly, not here to litigate it, but get it out there and just be aware of what's going on around us. I don't know. There's not a great transition there into what we do. So we're just going to do it. Let's go ahead and get into the story. All right. So today we are going to discuss the SS Northern Pacific. This is not a liner that I had heard of before, but I was flipping through a book, and I don't know, the story kind of grabbed me. And as I was reading it, it just kept going. I kept waiting for the shipwreck to happen. And I don't know, it's kind of good value for your buck. We get multiple shipwrecks here.
Okay.
More shipwrecks, more fun.
That's what they say.
So the Northern Pacific is built by our old friends at William Cramp and Sons in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's actually the same shipyard that built the Atlas tanker that we've discussed. The Atlas was built in 1916, so just a couple years afterwards. I
had actually been reading. I thought that since the William Cramp company comes up so much, wanted to do a little bit more reading about them. Actually found a couple of articles on JSTOR involving them that might be worth diving into as a bonus episode at some point, because they have a big imprint on the shipbuilding industry in the U.S.
Cool. Yeah, that would be a really interesting deep dive to get into. So Northern Pacific is launched on October 17th, 1914, and she's fully completed by early 1915. Dimensions, she's 524 feet long, and she has a 63-foot beam. She also has a sister ship by the name of Great Northern, which for some reason I kept wanting to call this ship. I kept wanting to type Great Northern over and over.
Well, I was confused reading through it also that I thought it was switching, and then I realized it was a different ship.
And she's actually also built there at William Cramp and Sons. Both ships are basically identical, as identical as two massive objects like this can be. They're designed to carry 856 passengers, and yeah, I thought this was an interesting class configuration. She has 550 first class spots, 108 second, and 198 third. So it's really weird. I almost kind of wonder why they bother with second class.
Yeah.
And then she has around 224 crew when she's normally staffed. And she is built, we see this a lot for these type of steamers that they're not sailing transatlantic type things. They're going, up and down coasts or taking short, runs. But for the most part, she's going to carry a good bit of cargo as well. So she's a very practical vessel, but also pretty nice. I mean, she does have the class configurations and things like that. And they're actually both owned by the Great Northern Pacific Steamship Company in Astoria, Oregon. Go ahead and insert your Goonies reference there.
I was actually thinking of the Ataris because of their album So Long Astoria.
Yeah, which I don't even think they're from Astoria. That kind of hurt me.
That's why they were leaving. They didn't want to be there anymore.
Have you seen the Goonies?
I've seen it. I think it's one of those movies that if you see it if you don't see it when you're a kid, I don't know if you can appreciate it as much, because I've seen it, but I was probably 28 the first time I saw any of it. And it struck me as like just a bunch of kids screaming from what I remember of what I've seen. I can't say that I fully appreciated the Goonies because I think I was too old when I saw it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. We did not grow up watching that movie. And when I did finally see it, I was like, I don't get the magic of this movie. So like bring on the hate mail for that one, I guess. I know it's super popular. People like millennial aged people especially love it, but it was just not part of our childhood.
Maybe we're speaking for the oppressed silent majority, though.
Yes, also. We are the silent majority. So these vessels are both intended to sail between Astoria and San Francisco. So really not too far of a route. They're capable of about 23 knots. And this allows her to complete the journey in just about 24 hours. And this would be the same amount of time as the journey would have taken overland, except that, I mean, you have to think that's some pretty rugged terrain at the time. Like it still is, up in Northern California and everything. The interstate system doesn't exist. The passenger vessel is just the easier way to get that done. During the winter months, it's also not uncommon for the vessels to sail between San Francisco and Honolulu. Obviously, there's no plane traffic, but there's still going to be some tourist and trade traffic going that way. And, you have to be able to adapt and jump on that. Travel
in the Western Athletic Conference football schedule would have been a nightmare.
Absolutely. On March 25th, 1915, the Northern Pacific made her maiden voyage, and she actually sails from Philadelphia to San Francisco. And I thought that was kind of funny because I literally have the NFC Championship game on right now, and it's Philly and San Francisco. So an unintentional connection today. So as I'm sure most of our listeners are aware, I almost said readers. Can you imagine reading a podcast? That'd be the worst.
It's called a book.
So as I'm sure the listeners are aware, there's a lot of global events going on in 1915. Notably, on March 18th, 1915, this is just a few days before the Northern Pacific would leave Philadelphia, the Allied fleet would launch their assault on the Dardanelles, which would culminate in an absolutely spectacular failure after months of heavy fighting against the Ottoman Empire. So that's kind of the backdrop we're seeing here. The U.S. is not even involved in the war yet, but that's what's going on. So we have Gallipoli and all of those type things happening.
The sick man of Europe showing off his old man strength.
Yes, one last time. So the U.S. would eventually enter World War I on April 4th, 1917. In a process that we've seen before, the United States Shipping Board purchases the Great Northern from the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway on September 17th, 1917. She would be commissioned in Bremerton, Washington on November 3rd, 1917. During this time, she underwent a substantial refitting, and her name was officially changed to the USS Northern Pacific. Her luxurious interiors were stripped away and just made room for barracks. So basically everything became third class, I guess, judging by some of the descriptions I've heard of third class, sections of these ships.
Can't pay extra for the first class cabin on the troop ship.
Yeah, there's no upgrades on the troop ship.
Also, by name change, do you just mean the USS was added?
Yeah, the name is officially changed from SS to USS. So like she becomes a legitimate wartime target, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So additionally, beyond the refitting and the name change, the vessel is armed. She gets 4 6-inch guns, 2 1-pound guns, and 2 machine guns. So, she's definitely not like an attack vessel, but enough to maybe deter a U-boat or at least chase it away. And her sister vessel would actually undergo the same treatment. So both of these vessels are purchased by the U.S. Shipping Board and converted to armed troop ships. On March 7th, 1917, Northern Pacific would depart San Francisco for New York City. She would transit the Panama Canal and become part of the Cruiser and Transportation Squadron. This is something I didn't know about, and I kind of want to do some more research. I kind of only on a surface level looked at it. This unit's responsible for the transport of men and material from the United States to France. Transportation Force was made up of 2 different divisions. There was the New York Division, and they were commanded by Rear Admiral Albert Gleaves, and the Newport News, Virginia Division, commanded by Rear Admiral Hilary P. Jones.
I was actually reading about both of them just to see if they had any interesting connections to anything else. And Albert Gleaves, actually, in the interwar period, he actually gets up to some interesting stuff related to things we've discussed. That deals with torpedoes. So okay. he and a team he was working with, they were, I don't know if they were the first or the just most successful, but playing around with the idea of steering torpedoes. So after they've been launched, being able to direct them on target more effectively. So rather than it just being basically a game of chance where you shoot it and hope, having a little bit more control over it.
Interesting.
Which obviously the torpedo becomes a lot more effective in the Second World War compared to what it was in the First World War. And he's at least partially responsible for that.
Interesting. It is always cool to find those connections. So these 2 divisions are primarily made up of American and French vessels, with additional foreign vessels operating in the Newport News Division. It was pretty interesting. There's a lot of like random ones in there, various different parts of the UK. Italy, I believe, had a vessel in this flotilla. Like, it's pretty interesting seeing like who contributes to this. And then each of those divisions are composed of 2 separate branches, essentially. There's the transport vessels and the cruiser escorts. So it was really interesting to see like logistically how all of that is grouped together. So Northern Pacific would operate out of Hoboken Port of Embarkation in Hoboken, New Jersey. And that's basically right there in New York Harbor. She's able to carry as many as 2,780 soldiers in one trip. And she would make a total of 11 trips, carrying over 22,000 soldiers to France. One source that the main source I used said 11. Another source I saw said 13, but for our purposes, we're going with 11. That math kind of checks out. She would also be used to carry 5,683 wounded soldiers home. Yeah, that's something you don't think about as like the reverse logistics of something like that, of carrying like these wounded soldiers back and everything, and like how miserable that could have been, to be part of that, but also like how necessary it is.
Right.
And during this time, she's actually dubbed the Ghost Ship by U-boat commanders, as she's simply too fast to be pursued. I know we kind of talked about that in like the Lusitania episode, that, one of Lusitania's best qualities and the reason that she didn't have to worry about U-boats as much in theory is because of how fast she was.
She even has a similar top speed here. I think with all her boilers running and fully manned and everything, Lusitania could get to like 24 knots. Even though she wouldn't hit that on her final voyage. But yeah, similar idea. The idea that the primary protection that the ship has is the fact that nothing should be able to catch her.
Obviously, like in World War II, that changes with U-boat advancements. But still at this time, like U-boats are pretty limited in what they can actually do. So in 1918, another global calamity made an appearance on board the vessel. In September of 1918, influenza swept the ship. The sick bays quickly overflowed, and the ship's corridors are actually lined with cots. That's how bad it gets. A total of 7 soldiers and 3 crewmen actually die while making the crossing to France due to influenza.
I actually thought that number sounded really low.
Yeah.
For a troop ship that has a flu outbreak at this time, I would have assumed it would at least be into like the double digits or further into the double digits of
And I mean, I guess that number could actually be higher because those are just the ones that died en route. 350 men had to be carried off the vessel when they arrived in France. So like out of that group, who knows what happened to them. But not a good time. Just not a good time. Looks like I've titled this portion Shipwreck Number 1. So
Okay.
The first day of the new year, 1919, would not prove to be a happy one for the Northern Pacific. She was bound for New York, carrying just shy of 3,000 wounded and sick soldiers. So already like not a great time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as she nears the United States coast, conditions are less than ideal. A thick fog blankets what's already a dark nighttime sky. It's in this darkness that Northern Pacific runs aground off of Fire Island. That's one of the barrier islands that runs along Long Island in New York. That's an interesting bit of geography. It's not something I knew that well, but I've just kind of been looking at it.
It's like a little Outer Banks for New York.
It is. It is. And actually, I thought it was interesting. Fire Island today is actually more known as like a summer home destination for celebrities. People like the list I saw had Tina Fey, Mel Brooks, John Lennon. Not that he's really using it right now. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. It's always interesting to see kind of how these communities change over time and develop. But knowing that this could be potentially a massive and tragic situation, the Navy wastes no time in responding. So it's kind of nice to see a good rapid response happen. That's not something that always occurs in these stories.
I think this is an interesting story and scenario here because we've covered the Britannic, and one of the sort of silver linings to the Britannic story is that she was theater bound rather than returning with a ship full of wounded and sick soldiers. And this gives us a little bit of a look into what might that have looked like if this ship starts to sink and it is full of people.
Yeah, like you have all of the problems of a regular like ship type disaster, but like you get to be a hospital too on top of that.
And even a lot of the, especially at this time, before we have the more modern rescue and survival equipment, it really does come down to physical fitness and ability to survive. And so a lot of these people who may otherwise have been able to save themselves are sick or wounded, and they can't physically swim or get off the ship.
So, like I said, the Navy responds, very rapidly. Doctors are sent by train and staged for a rapid response. The hospital ships Solace and Seneca are dispatched to the scene, along with the troop ship Mallory. In addition to that, there's also the cruiser USS Des Moines and about a dozen destroyers, along with various tugs and submarine patrol craft. So a huge response to this stricken vessel. In addition to the U.S. Navy response, lifesavers from the stations at Point O Woods, Oak Island, and Fire Island also began to prepare their equipment. So this is actually the same organization that we had been talking about a little bit lately with the Metropolis. So it's interesting to see kind of how they perform here. Fortunately for the lifesavers, the seas were calm as they began to work on the beach. And despite these calm conditions, the lifesavers still decide to go ahead and fire a line out to the vessel so that a breeches buoy could be used, just in case the weather suddenly changed. And this is actually what the crew was trying to do in the Metropolis story, is fire that across. And that line allows you to like kind of strap into a harness and move between those things. It's really interesting to see it happen, but it's interesting to see it work properly in this scenario. It doesn't look pleasant. Like it's not great, but it's better than nothing.
It's come up in a couple stories. I think we first talked about this concept in the Valencia episode, but seeing one at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc is cool because they have a Lyle gun and a breeches buoy. And so you can kind of see what does this look like up close. The Lyle gun, much smaller than I thought it would be, first of all.
So after attaching the line, a surf boat is launched and they proceed to make contact with the ship. This is like one of these fun moments in history that I love so much. Once the life-saving guys make contact, they see the scene on board and it's festive. There appears to be no immediate concern and most of the men are just enjoying a New Year's party. So I think that's just so funny that, like, everybody's reacting to this and like you get on there and everybody's like, oh, what's wrong? Like, what's the big deal? Like, we're stuck, but we're not worried about sinking.
This would be a great opportunity for the epic handshake meme. You could have like various celebrities and then USS Northern Pacific. And then in the middle on the hands is New Year's party on Fire Island.
Right? That's basically what it is. So the only naval vessels that were capable of directly approaching the Northern Pacific were the submarine patrol craft. So they're pretty small. They're able to operate in the shallow waters there. This is thought to be a safer option than transferring people to surf boats. And we're talking like the worst of the worst, the people that can't move their legs or maybe are missing a limb. They make the decision to transfer them into the patrol craft.
Mm-hmm.
And as we probably know by now, that's not as easy as like wheeling them over on a stretcher. The bedridden soldiers are actually lowered down in a basket litter down the side of the Northern Pacific and onto the small patrol craft below. I can't imagine. Like, that would be the worst, getting lowered like 50 feet down the side of a ship.
Yeah, when you're already not in good shape.
Yeah. Those who could were transferred to the surf boats that had been launched. And actually, as one of these boats is coming to shore, it capsizes. And in a moment of pretty awesome bravery, a man by the name of Lieutenant John Rouleau was cited for his bravery as he jumped into the water 3 times to rescue wounded soldiers who were not able to swim for themselves. So it's kind of one of those things where you see someone do it multiple times where like once is kind of a reaction, but like the next 2 like are kind of premeditated. You're like knowingly going back in to save these people. So it's pretty cool. In total, it would take around 4 days to remove all personnel from the stranded vessel. So as you can see, the situation gets controlled pretty quickly. There's not a lot of worry about the vessel breaking up or taking too much damage, and they're able to get everyone removed. So unintentionally, this story is just kind of a great juxtaposition to the metropolis. So with the vessel evacuated, attention is now shifted to salvage. Seaman Percy Egger describes the scene as follows.
3 tugs were employed at each tide to pull on each side, and we had 5 kedge anchor lines made fast to our heavy hawsers. We pulled on these, and if there was any slack, we held it. Barges were sent out from New York, and we commenced putting life rafts, boat davits, and our 4 6-inch guns aboard them to lighten the ship. The ship would move astern and out toward deep water at each pull. Some pulls were made as follows: 16 feet, 9 feet, 20 feet, 11 feet, 60 feet, 107 feet, and so on. After about 10 days, it began to look as if we were to stay on the sand for a good while. Finally, on the evening of the 18th, at 8:05, we'd moved 250 feet, and a little later she started to move more rapidly. And at 8:57, she was afloat. The crew went wild with cheering, and you never saw a happier bunch in all your life, for we had spent 18 days on the sand.
Yeah, that's just such an interesting story. Like, imagine that becoming your life for 3 weeks, basically. Like, just out on the sand trying to get this ship off of a sandbar.
I do think it's interesting here comparing it to some of the ones we've discussed around this time period. But there's that famous line from Margaret Mackworth with Lusitania of, "I always thought a shipwreck was an organized affair." And here we see that, yeah, sometimes it can be, depending on the situation. This is a very organized, well set up evacuation where no one has any real reason to panic, and they can take 4 days to get people off of this thing.
It is so nice to see one of these stories work out like the way it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
The Northern Pacific would then be towed to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The vessel would require 6 months of repair work before she would be serviceable again. Her stern posts and after frames were severely damaged from all of the wave action and being stuck on the sandbar. And by the time this work is completed, the U.S. Navy no longer needs her. She would be decommissioned on August 20th, 1920, and transferred to the Army Transportation Service. While serving with the ATS, the Northern Pacific was involved in a notable incident involving the American steamer Powhatan. This incident is actually reported on by the New York Times as follows.
On January 20, 1920, the transport was returning with the last contingent of the American troops from France when she picked up an SOS call from the American steamship Powhatan, which was drifting helplessly off the Nova Scotian coast, and rescued her passengers and brought them to New York.
So it's interesting, like we've seen people get saved from her, and now she's doing the saving. I always find that stuff kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
The Times goes on to share another story in that same article about the vessel.
In the summer of the same year, the Northern Pacific was carrying General John J. Pershing on his trip through the Antilles, when she went ashore at the entrance to the harbor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, closing the port for several days until she was hauled off.
Note the spelling of Puerto Rico. That is how it spelled it in the article.
Porto.
Yes. And that it would also be, if we want to keep track here, I would call that shipwreck number 2, blocking off a port for a few days. I really like that would be a fun thing for like Twitter, like just like we did with the canal a few years ago. Like how many days has San Juan been cut off because of this ship?
There'd be like 5 novelty accounts set up.
Yes. In my notes here, it says this ship just loves a good beach visit.
Oh, for sure.
This brings us to November 22nd, 1921. The Northern Pacific was returned to the shipping board, who would later sell her to Pacific Steamship Company in February 1922. I thought it was interesting. One of the reasons they wanted to get rid of it is it was too fast. They didn't need it. It was too fast and too expensive to operate. Like it would be like, going to pick up your groceries in a Ferrari. Like, why? So as part of this sale, the shipping board agrees to pay $500,000 to have the ship refit for passenger service. So, that kind of makes sense, right? Like they're trying to sell these vessels off. Obviously, if you're a company, you don't want to buy it and then have to gut it. Like, hey, you need to sweeten it a little bit. So give them $500,000 to try to get it ready for passenger service again. And this work was done at another shipyard that we've talked about in the podcast, Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock in Chester, Pennsylvania. This company would actually be the one that built the Marine Electric in 1944.
Nice.
The Northern Pacific would depart New York at 6 p.m. on February 7th, bound for Philadelphia. She had a skeleton crew of only 28 men, and the journey was expected to be a short one, only around 12 hours. Because remember, all she's doing is moving from one shipyard to another. Just after midnight, Officer of the Watch A.B. Wilson smelled smoke and immediately reported it to the captain, a man by the name of Lusty. The captain dispatched the first officer, who was named Jellison, to go investigate. First Officer Jellison followed the smell aft and ventured lower into the ship before making a shocking discovery. He found thick black smoke pouring out from one of the lower holds. The smoke was so intense that he was almost overcome, but he was able to crawl out on his hands and knees. He promptly notified the captain and made his way to the crew's quarters to alert off-duty personnel. Captain Lusty acted quickly, taking control of the bridge, and he ordered A.B. Wilson to assist Jellison. So, he's taking charge of the situation. He's making stuff happen. It's what you want in a captain. It quickly becomes apparent that the flames have spread so quickly that Jellison's escape route is cut off. Wilson was nearly overcome by flames and smoke, but he was able to tell what happened next. Wilson was nearly overcome by flames and smoke, but he was able to tell what happened next. While reporting this to the master on the bridge, it was necessary to shut ourselves in the wheelhouse to avoid suffocation. Wilson added that he thought the ship was gone. The entire scene took place in less than 4 minutes from the initial report. That's pretty crazy how quickly this gets out of hand.
Yeah.
In the midst of all this, Captain Lusty has ordered the ship to make a course for shore. By the time that order is given, the vessel is about 20 miles from the closest point of land. So not far, but not close when you have a rapidly spreading fire. As the vessel came to, the lights are lost and the telemotor blows out. This results in injuries to the helmsman, and the captain is no longer able to control the rudder. So that's never good when you can't steer yourself. That's usually not a good sign of things to come.
I had to look up what the telemotor was. I don't think that's a term that has come up before.
I don't think it has either. Do you want to share your findings?
My understanding is that the telemotor is just a part of the control system between the steering console and the actual steering gears.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
If you were to lose it, it would just, your stuff can't talk to each other. You're basically just losing steering.
Beyond losing steering, the other problem that they have is they have no ability to communicate with the engine room, as it's now completely cut off by fire. So you can't steer, you may or may not have propulsion, and you definitely don't have control over the propulsion. So that's bad. By this time, Jellison has made his way back to the bridge, and he's confirmed what's already obvious to the captain. The ship is in major trouble. The smoke's now become so thick in the pilot house that they're actually forced to abandon it and move outside. As you would expect from a vessel that can no longer propel or control herself, she's at the mercy of the wind. And so she swings around and she's broadside to the wind, which is never a good time. Lifeboat number 1 was prepared and swung out, and then the captain orders Jellison and 4 others to launch the boat and take it aft to gather the engineers that are hopefully mustering on the other side of the fire. They don't even know what the other side of the other section of the ship knows. Mm-hmm. Like, they just hope that everyone's kind of gotten in position that maybe they can rescue them. Lifeboat 3 was quickly rendered inaccessible due to the intense smoke that surrounded it. It was just so thick and heavy that there was no way that they would be able to launch that boat. Lifeboat 4 was lowered and given the same instructions to move aft and attempt rescue of the engineers. It was pretty good self-awareness of the captain to tell these guys, like, hey, get off, but you need to go back there and see who you can help. Mm-hmm. The captain would then remain on board with lifeboat number 2 for about another hour until the entire boat deck was consumed by flames. Finally, he makes the decision to take himself and the few remaining crew off. So he's unsure if the attempted rescue has occurred in the aft section of the ship, and he also orders his boat, lifeboat number 2, to investigate. However, it quickly becomes apparent that this is not going to be possible as the wind carries the fiery hulk further away from them. Basically, they can't keep up with the vessel as it's being pushed by the waves and the wind and everything.
The development there of you've got this part of the ship blocked off from the other, and so you sort of have 2 different sinkings going on where one can't talk to the other. And it reminds me a lot of, we talked about it mainly in the 1913 Great Lakes storm, of when those situations develop. And in those cases, it was because of the wind and the ice. You've got the front and the aft of, one of these big freighters. You basically can't get from one side to the other. So the stern has no idea what's going on in, say, in the wheelhouse. And this obviously for very different reasons, this time because of smoke and fire, but it has some of the same elements of you just have to hope and assume that the other guys are taking steps and you can go get them. Yeah,
it is interesting when it's not one unified effort and you do have to kind of hope you have the right people that can take charge and organize that. Mm-hmm. I think you even see that in like that movie that we did for bonus episode, that the guy who kind of leads it isn't even a quote unquote leader, of men normally, but he's competent and capable. So as all this is going on, the nearby vessel SS Transportation acts quickly upon seeing the flames. That's a great name for a cargo ship.
It's interesting. It seems like a hastily thought of name.
Right. Like, we've got this ship we built. What should we name it? Transportation? She's captained by Seth Chase. He states that the ship was in flames from end to end. We made all speed to her assistance. At 2:45 a.m., Captain Lusty and the men on board his boat are picked up by the SS Transportation. So again, it's good to see like things working the way they're supposed to here. They actually are surprised to see that the first officer and the men that had evacuated on lifeboat number 1 are already on board. So that has to be a pretty good feeling as well, knowing that they've already been picked up. Half an hour later, they encounter a motor launch that carried the chief engineer and about a dozen others who had been trapped on the aft section of the Northern Pacific. So these are the men that they had been attempting to rescue. They had been rescued by someone else. So again, things working out the way they're supposed to.
So they had been able to launch a lifeboat?
The story's a little ambiguous as to what this motor launch is. I read it as it was just another vessel coming to aid.
Oh, I see. So they got up close enough to the ship to get people off. Oh.
Possibly from the SS Transportation, I would imagine, or some other vessel that responded. Most of the sources were pretty ambiguous about where that vessel came from.
Okay.
But these are the men that the captain had been so worried about.
All right.
Minutes later, the SS Transportation received a radio call from another vessel, the SS Herbert G. Wiley. And they had picked up lifeboat number 4. It's refreshing to see such a successful use of lifeboats for the evacuation. It's just not something we frequently encounter.
It also highlights the role that lifeboats are intended to play around this time of, that's not your ultimate salvation. That's supposed to get you to another ship in the area. So you're ideally not supposed to be in them for very long. And, fortunately here we have the assets in the area that is how it works out.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, these things aren't meant to be in for more than a couple hours. So knowing that all lifeboats were accounted for, Captain Lusty conducted a head count. This revealed that 4 men were missing. All of these men were employees of Sun Shipbuilding. Their cabins had been located directly over the location where the fire started. Captain Chase is actually able to position the transportation near the Northern Pacific, close enough that she can sweep the deck with her spotlight to search for any signs of life. The transportation would actually stay on scene and wait until dawn before approaching again, but yet again, no signs of life are found on board the vessel. Captain Chase wouldn't leave the scene until around 10 a.m. By that time, the Coast Guard cutter Kickapoo was arriving on scene, and he reports that the stricken vessel had a list of around 30 degrees when he left. So now the Coast Guard cutter Kickapoo, she's on scene. She would continue to search the area, including about 15 miles downwind from the accident site, before returning to search the vessel again. So obviously, you always have that nagging feeling of like, what if someone's out there? You have to do these searches, but they are very thorough. When they do arrive back on the scene, though, the hull is glowing red hot, and they're actually only able to approach to about a quarter of a mile away because of the heat. Like, that's intense to have the metal and everything glowing. Like, that is a hot and sustained fire.
Yeah, that's getting into some of the firefighting elements of it, like we talked about with the Noronic. And that's an aspect that I think flies under the radar with these, is that even if you've got people on scene, you can't necessarily get on board because this is now a superheated metal tube, right? And it's going to take a while to cool off.
At 3 p.m., the vessel finally rolls over and sinks, and it's assumed that the 4 missing employees had been overcome by the smoke and fire and died probably pretty early on in this incident. More than likely, they didn't even attempt evacuation from their cabins. An investigation by the Department of Commerce was unable to provide an answer as to how the fire started. However, records indicate at the time of her loss, the vessel was valued at about $2 million by her insurance company. So kind of an unsatisfying story, honestly, that like, we don't know what happened. And unfortunately, we never will know what happened in this one, because there's just no one that wants to find out, that has the means or the resources to do so. I mean, you would have to assume probably carelessly storing materials. There'd been a lot of work done on the vessel. It's also a time where everybody smokes. And we've seen from other stories that one discarded cigarette or cigar or match can, cause an absolute inferno very quickly, given the right conditions.
All of these older ones where they don't know how a fire started, it's like, there's any number of accidental ways it could have started.
Even with all the work being done with like electric and stuff, I mean, it could have been, faulty wiring or something. So there's just an infinite number of things it could have been. Today, the wreck of the Northern Pacific lies about 30 miles south of Cape May, New Jersey. She actually wouldn't be discovered until about 1967. She's discovered by John Dudas and Bill Scheibel, 2 wreck divers. They're actually searching for the destroyer USS Jacob Jones. The Jacob Jones was a Wicks-class destroyer sunk in February of 1942 by a German U-boat. And I think that's always one of my favorite things in these stories, is these people that are looking for something and they stumble across something else. Like, that has to be a pretty cool feeling.
And you see different steps that process takes, because sometimes you'll have people looking for something, find something different, but still contending that it is the thing they were looking for, until like they find something that's incontrovertible. Whereas, here finding something, this is actually a new discovery.
Yeah. And, a pretty big one, honestly, like a fairly large vessel with a pretty interesting past. So that's fun, that kind of stuff. So currently, Currently, as of 1990, when the book was made that I used for a source here, this vessel is a pretty remote site. So she's actually one of the better places to dive in the Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey area, just because she's not being visited very often. Our old friend Gary Gentile states that the site is full of artifacts and interesting discoveries. It hasn't been picked over the way that so many others have.
Except for all the things lining the walls of Gary Gentile's study.
Yeah, don't worry about that. So the Northern Pacific's sister ship, the Great Northern, would go on to sail for decades. She was put into service with Admiral lines and reverted back to her passenger configuration. So she got to live the life that her sister never had.
So all these ships getting sent their passenger and then their troop ships and then they're back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Snip, snap, snip, snap.
So at the start of World War II, she would be put into service again by the U.S. government as a troop ship. And after undergoing multiple name changes, her final name would be the George S. Simons. Ultimately, she would be scrapped with little fanfare in 1948. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Great Northern gets to do all the things that the Northern Pacific should have done as well. However, the Northern Pacific is remembered, I would say. It's written about in books, whereas the Great Northern is kind of more of just a footnote. I guess it's the whole you'd rather burn out than fade away.
Just going to point that out. Yeah.
Which I realize as I was saying it, I was not going for the pun there, but it happened. That was not intentional. These are the kind of stories that are like a meat and potato kind of story, I feel like, right? Like it's not the Lusitania. It's not something like that, but it's still so interesting because so many people, this ship was probably the most important ship they ever got on.
Mm-hmm.
It took them to France where their life changed, and it brought them back to the United States as a changed person fighting in World War I. Some people probably had the best and worst days of their lives on board this ship. That's super interesting. And I don't know. I don't have a lot else to add on this one, just that it's just another interesting shipwreck story. I guess also just a warning of absolutely how dangerous fire is at sea.
I think it's interesting to see these ships as not just a vehicle, but they're also all of the experiences that happen on board them. And especially where you've got these that are transporting just masses of humanity back and forth across the Atlantic.
Even as her time as a regular passenger steamer, too, you saw all these interactions and stories that happen between people.
And yeah, these are the fun stories, I think, that are, from a podcast perspective, a lot more fun and engaging to learn about and to read about, because you can pick up some new things. You have new avenues to explore because you didn't know about this before.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think that's all we have for this one today. Hope you guys have a great week, and we'll do it again.